So if you got European or Asian heritage, you might want to brace yourself for a pretty wild reality check. Right now, literally hiding inside your genetic code is a tiny fragment of DNA from the closest thing humanity ever had to a sibling. Some scientists call them our sister species, but honestly, as we unpack the data today, you're going to see why it's way more accurate to call them superhuman. We're talking about Neanderthals, and quite frankly, they were absolute freaks of nature. Let's just dive right into this. When I say the word Neanderthal, what instantly pops into your head? It's probably that old textbook cartoon stereotype, right? You know, the dim, hunched caveman shuffling along with a club, like the ultimate evolutionary runner-up. Well, we need to take that image and completely throw it out the window. Because when you actually look at the biology of these people, the structure of their bones, the insane capacity of their lungs, the size of their brains, that picture isn't just a little unfair, it's flat out wrong.
Section 1. The dumb caveman myth. Shattering the stereotype.
Section 2. Built like a tank. Their formidable physical frame. To really understand them, we have to look at the world that actually forged them. Neanderthals lived across Eurasia during the Ice Age, and this was a brutally unforgiving landscape, stalked by woolly mammoths and massive cave bears. They didn't just endure this nightmarish world, they were finely tuned to absolutely dominate it. Now, if you saw a Neanderthal from a distance, they were slightly shorter than us. The tallest specimen we found, Amud 1, stood at about 5'10", but their real defining trait wasn't height, it was mass. An average Neanderthal male weighed around 180 pounds, which is roughly 20% heavier than a modern man of the exact same height. And that weight? It was all thicker, denser bone and packed muscle. Their skeleton was nearly twice as compact as ours. They were quite literally built like tanks. And that tank-like frame generated some raw, terrifying power. See, Neanderthals didn't hunt by picking off prey from a safe distance with a bow and arrow. No way. They got up close and personal, driving heavy thrusting spears into massive animals like horses, rhinos, and, yes, full-grown mammoths. Doing that required a lifetime of violent, repetitive force, which gave them these thick, almost Popeye-like forearms. Just to put this into perspective, one estimate suggests their muscular architecture allowed them to haul 50 pounds of meat for nearly 30 miles. And for a Neanderthal, that wasn't some elite endurance workout. That was just a typical Tuesday. But as you can probably guess, all that raw power and that close-quarters lifestyle came at a really brutal cost. Which brings us to this frankly shocking statistic. A systematic survey of Neanderthal skeletons found that somewhere between 79% and 94% of them showed signs of serious, fully healed trauma. Just think about that number for a second. Nearly every single adult Neanderthal we pull out of the ground survived blunt force fractures, severely broken bones, or amputations. To really ground those statistics, let's look at one famous older male specimen. Over the course of his life, this guy lost the use of his right arm. He took a blow to the face, hard enough to actually blind him in one eye, and he suffered such severe, repeated trauma to his head that he likely went completely deaf in both ear canals. And yet, he kept living. Because his community tenderly cared for him and kept him alive. Scientists point out that this massive bodily damage came from a brutal cocktail of up-close hunting and incredibly violent encounters with huge animals. Think cave bears. And these animals were fighting back defensively because the Neanderthals were actively picking fights with them. Section 3. The Ice Age engine, fueling the prehistoric powerhouse. So to move that much mass and engage in literal hand-to-hand combat with cave bears, their internal engine room had to be absolutely off the charts. They had this massive, barrel-shaped ribcage housing lungs that were roughly 20% larger than ours. Take one exceptional male specimen known as Cabara 2. He has an estimated lung volume of 9 liters. Now, until very recently, the absolute greatest lung capacity ever recorded in a modern human athlete was 8.5 liters. And to feed those giant lungs, their famous wide noses acted as a precision instrument, rapidly warming and humidifying the freezing Ice Age air. All of this oxygen fueled a body that burned a staggering 4,500 to 6,700 calories every single day. Section 4. Built for the sprint. Explosive power over endurance. Okay, knowing about those massive lungs and exactly how much energy they burned, you'd probably assume they were these elite long-distance runners, right? Like they were capable of chasing prey to exhaustion over miles and miles. Which leads us to a really fun hypothetical question. Could you beat a Neanderthal in a foot race? Well, the surprising truth is, despite those giant lungs, they were actually pretty terrible at endurance running. Their anatomy was engineered for something completely different. And the reason all comes down to fast-twitch muscle fibers. While modern humans have a pretty balanced mix, Neanderthals carried a vastly higher concentration of the fast-twitch kind. Everything about their lower bodies, from their relatively short leg bones to their long, wide toes for a powerful push-off, to their long, narrow Achilles tendons, was perfectly tuned for a short, devastating, explosive sprint to instantly close the gap on their prey. So, the crucial takeaway here is this. If a Neanderthal were somehow resurrected today and challenged you to a foot race, whatever you do, do not agree to a 100-meter dash. You would be absolutely obliterated. You have to make it a marathon. Over a long, sustained distance, our modern human anatomy for endurance finally takes over. A marathon is, quite literally, your only chance to outlast their explosive power. Section 5. Brains, brawn, and bite. Reassessing Neanderthal intelligence. For a very long time, the go-in assumption was that all of this heavy muscle must have come at the expense of intellect. But when we actually compare the data side by side, the average Neanderthal male brain case was around 1,640 cubic centimeters. Guys, that's about 30% larger than the modern human average. Now, obviously, size isn't everything, and their brains were shaped differently than ours. For instance, a massive amount of brain real estate was dedicated just to processing vision, supporting eyes that were 15% larger than ours. That gave them vastly superior night vision in those dim northern winters. But make absolutely no mistake, their brains were undeniably huge. And that massive brain size translated directly into high intelligence and really deep social complexity. The archaeological record proves, without a doubt, that they coordinated incredibly complex hunts, they crafted highly sophisticated tools, they created cave art, they tenderly cared for their severely injured community members, and they almost certainly communicated using spoken language. So that whole image of the mindless brute, yeah, that is entirely dead. Even features we used to think were just brutish turn out to be marks of super clever adaptation. Take their heavy jaw and big teeth, for example. For decades, scientists just assumed this meant they had some sort of bone-crushing bite force. But recent studies show their bite was actually roughly the same as ours. So why the huge mouth? Well, distinctive scratch patterns on their front teeth, patterns that definitely weren't caused by chewing, reveal that they constantly use their jaws as a literal third hand to grip hides and meat tightly. This freed up both of their actual hands to work with their tools. And this heavy, constant utilization of their teeth makes perfect sense when we look at their diet. Isotope analysis shows that they were hyper-carnivores. Roughly 70% of their massive 5,000-plus daily calorie requirement came strictly from meat alone. They were out there pulling, biting, and working heavy hides and muscle literally every single day just to survive. Section 6. Our superhuman sister species, the Neanderthal legacy today. As I mentioned right at the start of this explainer, millions of people today carry Neanderthal DNA. So you're probably wondering, does any of this apply to you right now? Do you secretly have their super strength or some biological need for a 70% meat diet? Well, the honest answer is mostly no. You didn't inherit their tank-like bone density, unfortunately. However, modern research tells us that their DNA subtly nudges our internal workings. While the exact impact is still heavily debated in the scientific community, there's growing evidence that this inherited DNA affects subtle physical appearance traits and even plays a real role in our internal immune responses, protecting us from diseases our own ancestors encountered when they first left Africa. And honestly, all of this leaves us with a profound new respect for our evolutionary siblings. They were absolutely not failed humans. As our source so brilliantly summarizes, they were a magnificent superhuman branch of our family built for a world that would have destroyed us. When you sit back and compare our fragile modern frames to their heavy Ice Age engineering, it forces a pretty provocative question. Were they the freaks of nature, or were we all along? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking deeper.